Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, good night, whatever time that it may be for you in your time zone. Welcome to this inaugural International Association of Genocide Scholars book launch webinar. I'm Dr. Melanie O'Brien. I'm the president of IAGS, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here for this book launch. Our book launch webinar series is designed to promote the work of IAGS members, and it will consist of discussions with authors about their recent publications. And this webinar is the first in our series, and I am delighted to introduce our two speakers tonight. First of all, we have our discussant, who is Dr. Stephanie Wolf, and Stephanie is Associate Professor in Political Science and Philosophy at Weber State University in the USA. Stephanie specialises in international politics and human rights with an emphasis on genocide, crimes against humanity, and atrocities. She received her PhD in International Relations from the University of Kent, Brussels School of International Studies in 2011. Her publications include The Politics of Reparations and Apologies, which focuses on the aftermath of World War II atrocities, and she has published book chapters on global reparations and apologies, the perception of justice following atrocity, Rwanda, and genocide memorials. Stephanie has also served on the IAGS Executive Board as the New Media Communications Officer. And I am delighted to present today's webinar's author, Dr. Kerry Whigham. Kerry is Assistant Professor of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, or IGMAP, in the USA. Kerry received his PhD in Performance Studies from New York University. Kerry is the curator of Activism, an art exhibition on the connection between art, activism, and atrocity prevention that began in Venice during the 2019 Art Biennale and is now travelling to museums around the world. Kerry's research focuses on the way post-atrocity societies remember and engage with the past, along with how that violent past impacts the present and the future. In particular, his research engages the creation and curation of public memory sites, as well as grassroots civil society activism, both as a means for shaping public memory and transforming conflict societies. As part of this work, Kerry has conducted field work across Latin America, Europe, and the United States. In addition to his academic work, he is the Director of Research and Online Education at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. He is also the Communications Officer on the Executive Board for IAGS. We're going to now hear about some of that work that Kerry has done, which he has published in his book, Resonant Violence, Affect, Memory, and Activism in Post-Genocide Societies. And I will now hand over to Stephanie and Kerry.
Thank you very much, Mel, for your introduction. I am pleased to be here today. And first, I just want to start out by saying, Kerry, thank you so much for writing this book. It was wonderful to read. I really enjoyed it and have extensive highlight marks all over of things that I want to remember and potentially include my own work for memorials. I'm just, yes. And so I would like to just to jump on in. Could you tell us what is the resonant violence?
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephanie. Thanks also to Mel for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation to present the book. And thanks to all of you for logging on or for watching this recording later. I should start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the ancestral territory of the Oneida and Onondaga peoples, who are themselves victims of genocide and resonant violence, which leads right into an answer to that question. So resonant violence is a concept that I develop in the book to talk about how genocidal violence continues long after the violence we physically, we usually label as genocide, that physical violence of mass killing, long after that comes to an end. So it's really a way of thinking about how this affective or emotional social environment that is created long before genocide takes place, and that actually is necessary for genocide to take place. And also that that energy that continues to resonate long after the physical acts of killing come to an end. So for instance, if we think about this, paradigmatic case of the Holocaust, we can think about the fact that the actual the attempts to physically annihilate the European Jewish population didn't really start en masse until the late 1930s. But of course, before that, we saw the gradual constriction of the social and political life of Jewish people in Germany, starting with the rise of Hitler in 1933. And even before that, the sort of anti-Semitism that was latent within German society, and sometimes not so latent, that allowed for the rise of the Nazi Party. So all of that energy that eventually escalated and allowed for the death camps to be built and all of the killing to happen in the Eastern Front during the war, that didn't just disappear when the Allied forces won World War II in 1945, when the camps were finally liberated. Jewish survivors continued to experience different forms of social and political violence long into the future. And in fact, we still see anti-Semitism today with neo-Nazi groups and far-right ideologies that are still very much present. In genocide studies, we typically focus on those moments where the violence is at its most heightened and most visible. But actually, if we want to really talk about preventing genocide, we also have to attend to those other forms that violence can take, those environments, those social environments that allow for that violence to happen, and take care of all of those aspects of the violence that may still be present, though less visible, if we really want to prevent recurrence from happening. So this is sort of the idea that I'm trying to get at with this concept of resonant violence.
And can you tell me what drew you to this topic?
Well, for a long time, I've been really interested in the ways that that societies deal with the legacies of genocide and other mass atrocities. At the state level through transitional justice processes, for instance, but also at the civil society and really even at the interpersonal level, because ultimately genocide and other atrocities are these complex social and political phenomenon that in fact infiltrate every aspect of life. So oftentimes we speak about it happening at the state level, but really it's also, we see the microdynamics of these atrocities happening at every single level down to the interpersonal, the relationship between neighbors, right? So I've long been fascinated in that, and in focusing on the way that societies deal with that aftermath, the thing that has struck me again and again is that we talk about the legacies of genocide more often as if they're sort of unfortunate byproducts of the violence. And I think that actually, and what I'm trying to get at with this idea of resonant violence is that we need to be thinking about them as actually part and parcel of the genocide itself. It's actually the genocide continuing, just in a different form, a form that may be a little less spectacular, a little less visible, but no less damaging to the lives of the groups that are suffering because of that violence. So when we're only focusing on preventing physical violence against groups, these other forms of violence go unattended to, but still do a lot of damage. So, and that's why we see things like long-term institutionalized discrimination against identity groups, economic disparities between groups, social discrimination and isolation among different groups. And all of that is actually part of the genocide continuing to perform. So if we really want to think about preventive measures in a holistic way, we need to think about all of the ways that genocidal violence manifests, not only that most visible way of mass killing of identity groups.
I think this directly relates to your first two comments, but I think it's very important. So I want to draw it out a bit more, is that so in your book and what you've been saying is you've argued that long-term atrocity prevention does not involve military intervention, which of course is what some people think of automatically. So can you describe how your theory of resonant violence can be utilized to prevent future atrocities?
Well, hopefully it's just a way of reframing and supporting like an idea that's already out there that many prevention practitioners are already put into practice all the time. A reframing of the way that we approach prevention, not just as scholars, of course, but for policymakers and practitioners as well. When the lay person hears that you do atrocity prevention work, they often think that what that means is intervention, and even more specifically, as you said, military intervention in the midst of mass killing when it's already taken place. But in fact, that is a really narrow understanding of what prevention work entails. That is an aspect of prevention, right? If mass killing has taken place, we do have a responsibility to stop that. And it may at points reach the need to use the military. Though if we've reached that point, then we've really failed at prevention. Now we're just trying to do crisis management. Real prevention, I think, involves a much broader lens. A lens that, as we and my colleagues at the Auschwitz Institute say, a multi-stage approach to prevention that involves not just that midstream prevention, but also looking far upstream and also looking downstream. So there are actions that we can take long before anything escalates to the point of mass violence to make sure it doesn't actually get to that point. And also when we put an end to the mass killing, those most visible aspects of violence, there are also actions that need to be taken in the aftermath to rebuild, to offer redress to the groups that have been most directly targeted, and to also reform the institutions that allowed for that violence to take place to begin with so that it doesn't recur. I mean, sadly, one of the things we know statistically speaking, is that societies that have experienced one of the biggest risk factors that puts a society at risk for atrocity is if they've experienced an atrocity already in the recent past. And that's not coincidental. That's actually, I would argue, most of the time related to the fact that societies don't attend to all of the ways that violence is manifest. There's been only a focus on bringing an end to the physical violence of mass killing, and not enough focus on dealing with all of the other aspects, structural aspects that allowed for that violence to take place to begin with, and that continue to exist in the aftermath of that violence. So real prevention involves looking at all of those aspects of what allows for the violence to take place and taking steps to mitigate those factors.
I definitely appreciate your discussion of structures in the book, because I think it's very important to kind of realize, as people think, I agree with you, whenever we're talking genocide studies, people see that idea of here's the genocide and oh, it's stopped. But I know in several cases where if they don't even repeal the laws that informed it, then those laws are still enforced. The violence still continues. And I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about your book was the discussion on this. Which leads directly to my next question. So I did appreciate the comment you made that the United States demonstrates how violence continues to perform and be performed upon into the present. Can you discuss how you see that resonant violence as a performance?
Yeah, so I comment to the field of genocide and atrocity studies and prevention from this really weird place where my PhD is in this field called performance studies. A lot of people hear that term and they think, they think of what we would traditionally call performances, theater, dance, things like this. And there are, in fact, people in the field of performance studies that study those kinds of performances. But there are others of us in the field that study things like political processes, religious ritual, things like that as a performance, through the lens of performance. And what we mean by that is studying it as this sort of constructed thing in which there are different actors playing different roles in many ways. But by looking at it as this constructed performance, it also gives us some tools to dismantle it and to find ways of flipping the script for how these performances play out. So violence is inherently performative because it does things to its the people at whom that violence is directed. It's really directly related to power as well. This book uses performance studies theory to talk about the way that violence manifests in genocide. And talking about the United States, I sort of open the book with the protest at Standing Rock and the occupation of Standing Rock several years ago in the United States, in which both Native and non-Native allies came together to protest the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was piping crude oil through unceded Sioux territory that was also going to contaminate the water supply. And in the face of those peaceful protests, the local sheriff's department turned water hoses and fired rubber bullets at these protesters, these indigenous protesters who were just protecting the land that was already theirs. This to me is such a clear example of resonant violence. And when we look at settler colonial contexts, we see it perhaps even more visibly than other cases of genocide, where what we saw at Standing Rock was indigenous people occupying land that was theirs, and settler colonial forces taking it from them. So it's almost this re-performance of this same kind of violence that we've seen for centuries, since 1492. So this is sort of what I'm trying to get at by thinking about it as the idea that this violence is being performed and re-performed, but also those civil society actions like the occupation of Standing Rock are a way for, it's not as if those indigenous activists have no agency, right? Of course they do. And that occupation of Standing Rock and that pushing back against that violence that they've experienced again and again is also an example of performing upon that violence, trying to change the way that violence is experienced in the way, and hopefully trying to change the way that it continues to perform in the future. So I don't know if that's clear, but that's sort of how I'm trying to think about these issues.
And I really liked the link of starting the book with that performance and then your discussion later of the occupation of Alcatraz Island. I thought that was a very nice link in there. And you can see that performance clearly kind of links to this previous performance in your case study. It was really interesting.
Thanks.
And so, of course, I work on memorials, so I love the chapter on memorialization and memorials. And so I thought it was very interesting how you distinguish between the modern and postmodern practices of memorialization. And I thought maybe you could talk more about those two and how this idea has come about.
Yeah, sure. So this chapter that Stephanie's talking about is this chapter it takes the form of a walking tour through Berlin, through the memorial landscape of Berlin. Excuse me, and sort of looks at various memorials that are all referring to the same period of time, to like the period of World War II and the Holocaust, but that have all been built at different periods of time in the aftermath since 1945 until the early 2000s. And what we see by looking at this, by doing this walking tour of these different memorials, is how the global memorial landscape has changed and the tools that we use to memorialize the past have changed drastically. So that tour starts with what I call the preeminent modern memorial, which is a war memorial. And that's not just modern, actually, it's quite ancient. Until the 20th century, most memorials and monuments drew from the same architectural language of the war memorial. We can think about the obelisks of ancient Egypt or the triumphal gates of ancient Rome. And really that same architectural language was just reproduced again and again throughout history into the 20th century, and still today in some cases, to commemorate war victory. Those traditional or modern monuments are also very much about they're being built by the state and built in an effort to consolidate state power. So we as viewers of those monuments are meant to be sort of in awe of these massive monumental structures and to see ourselves as subject to the state through our relationship with those monuments. Now that really had to change in the aftermath of the Holocaust the Armenian genocide, all of this violence of the 20th century, because what we saw was this moment where the state is no longer something to be celebrated all the time, but the state is a perpetrator, where there are these cases where now the state has inflicted this violence on its own citizens, right? Which of course is not necessarily new, but we started seeing it this way in the 20th century. So that language, that modern language of monuments had to change with that, because we couldn't tell the same stories about the state as we when we're telling the story of the Holocaust. So that's sort of what the rest of the chapter looks at, is what did that journey look like? And ultimately what we see is this move away from traditional monumentality and permanence towards memorials that are much more about abstraction, that are much more about engaging the visitor and coming down to the level of the individual visitor, so that that visitor can become even immersed within the memorial space and is actually part of the memorial. And this move away from a celebration of the state to memorials that are trying to create an empathetic or an empathic connection with victims and groups of people that have been victimized by the state. So that's sort of what that chapter is looking at, and that I call this postmodern turn that's happened not just in memorialization, but in many, many fields. This move away from grand meta narratives towards individual subjective experience.
And I just, continuing on the memorial theme, just because, of course, I'm very interested in that since I work on that. I've been to over 100 memorials in Rwanda, and I also did a similar tour in Germany of the memorials. So it was like coming home, I was like, I remember those. And so one of the things I've always been curious about is, do you think these memorials have a role in stopping that resonant violence? How can these memorials really impact this cycle of violence and stop it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually the question of like my current research project. For such a long time, there's been this notion that memorials, genocide memorials on their own are somehow inherently preventive. And I think it's really connected to this idea, this sentiment that gets expressed again and again by the philosopher George Santayana, who said, he who does not remember the past is condemned to repeat it. And inherent within that statement that gets uttered again and again in our field and others is this idea that memory on its own is preventive, that simply remembering the past is going to prevent it from happening again. And we know that that's not the case. Memory is a neutral term. Sometimes memory can be used for really positive things. At other times, memory can be used to justify incredible harm and incredible destruction. And all of us in the field of genocide studies can name countless examples where memory has not been preventive, but it has actually escalated risks for violence against certain groups. So the question then becomes, one, is it possible for memorials and spaces of memory to contribute to prevention? And if so, when do they do it and how do they do it? So not just accepting the idea that simply building a space is already going to be preventive, but asking what are the conditions under which these spaces can be preventive? So right now I'm working on a big research project that involves creating a huge database of over 1,500 memory sites around the world in more than 90 different countries that are memorializing past violence, and developing this big survey that's been sent out to all of those sites to ask them not what their sites are, but what they do. What is the programming that they have at these sites of memory that responds to or relates to current level risks, current risk of human rights abuse, current vulnerable populations living within those contexts? And that research that we're getting from the surveys is being supplemented by my and my research team visiting and talking to and observing programming at memory sites in 7 different countries representing different global regions. So that's Argentina, Cambodia, Colombia, Northern Ireland, Morocco, South Africa, Rwanda. I think that was 7. And we're really doing much more in-depth field work to see what are these sites doing. So we're really trying to disrupt that idea that building the site itself is preventive, but saying that these sites become preventive potentially when they're actually doing things, when the sites become filled with people who are coming together to respond to not just the past, but the present, that are recognizing what are the risk factors that are existent in our societies today, and how can the way that we engage with the past at these sites also have an impact on mitigating those risk factors in the present. So stay tuned. This is the project I'm deeply immersed in right now and really enjoying working on. Yeah, it's been really interesting just seeing some of the ways that sites are coming up with incredibly creative and inspirational ways for engaging with the past that's also having a very deep impact on the present.
I'll look forward to reading that next work too. So we've talked about the memorials, then I'm going to circle back to your discussion on Alcatraz Island. Could you describe that a little bit about that case study and how this impacts this resident violence?
Yeah, so that chapter is on this very specific case that it's not really well known in the US, especially by people who weren't alive at the period. So from 1969 to 1971, most people, when they hear Alcatraz, they just think of that, the prison that people visit in San Francisco Bay when they go to San Francisco. From 1969 to 1971, a group of Native American activists occupied Alcatraz, and they did it because of for a really interesting reason. There was a piece of a treaty signed in 1868 with the Sioux Nation that said that even though the U.S. would have control over this territory, that any decommissioned federal land would automatically revert to Sioux ownership, to indigenous ownership. So these activists saw this little piece of text in this treaty from 100 years before. And when Alcatraz prison was decommissioned, they said, oh, well, then that means that this should be indigenous land because it's decommissioned federal land. So they occupied it and claimed it as indigenous territory, and with the hopes of rebuilding it as this hub of indigenous cultural life in the San Francisco area. Of course, they didn't ultimately succeed at keeping Alcatraz because now you can go and visit it, and most people visit it and they're really only hearing about the escapees from the prison, the famous escapees and Al Capone, and they're not really hearing about the occupation, even though you can still see the graffiti from the occupation when you arrive in Alcatraz Island saying this is Indian land. But what's fascinating to me about that occupation, and the reason I focus on it and as a way of thinking about other similar occupations, is that even when these activist movements fail at their intended goal, at their stated goal at least, it doesn't mean they fail at doing other things that have a massive impact, because that occupation at Alcatraz Island actually led to a huge transformation in the way that the United States, and in particular the United States government, related to indigenous communities. It was actually the moment where official policy in the US changed from a policy of termination, where Native nations were being dissolved as political entities, and indigenous people were not being recognized as indigenous, to a policy of self-determination, where indigenous nations are at least ideal, and this isn't happening in practice as much as it should, of course, but they're supposed to be dealt with as sovereign nations within the United States, and dealt with as such. That policy is still in place today, and that is partly the occupation in Alcatraz is partly responsible for that. So when we're thinking about these activist movements, I think we need to pay attention to the fact that even when they might fail, in quotes, there are always things that they succeed at doing. So we need to think about all of the effects, the sort of ripple effects of these events, and not just look at them at their most face value.
That makes sense. Then, so I've asked a little bit about the first two case studies, and so kind of like to round it up, could you describe your next case study, and then I'll come back to ask a general question about the three of them.
Yeah, sure. So the three cases that the book deals with are violence relating to Indigenous people in the United States, um, uh, memory relating to the Holocaust in Europe, and then Argentina, which is really several chapters in the book are dedicated to Argentina, where I did lots of field work, and the very really creative ways that Argentinians have developed to deal with the legacies of the military dictatorship of 1976 to 1983. And two chapters in particular deal with Argentina. One focuses on the creative ways that they've transformed the former concentration and torture centers that were in operation during that period into vibrant, lively spaces of activism and human rights protections today. And also, another chapter focuses on the very creative activist practices that emerged. Most people know about the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who were, who are world renowned for their activist struggle to fight for the return of their children who were disappeared. But fewer people outside of Argentina may know about IAGS, which is a group that was formed by the children of the people who were disappeared. And in the 1990s, during this era of impunity where no one was being perpetrated or prosecuted for the crimes that they perpetrated during the dictatorship, IAGS developed this very this unique activist practice called the escrache, where they would take to the streets and march to the houses of perpetrators who they were known to be perpetrators, but who were living free and unpunished in Argentinian society. And they would mark those houses with paint and call for that person to be prosecuted. And the idea was that the state wasn't going to bring them to justice, but the state wasn't going to put them into jail. Well, they were going to make their own lives a jail, where if everyone knew who these perpetrators were, then maybe the baker would stop selling them bread, the newspaper vendor would stop selling them newspapers, the taxi driver would stop driving them. It was a way of making their own lives the jail that they should be in for the crimes that they perpetrated. And ultimately, that activist practice, along with many, many others that happened in Argentina, contributed to a real sea change in the way that the country as a whole dealt with the past. And now over 1,200 trials were reopened against perpetrators, and now over 1,200 perpetrators have been brought to justice through the official legal system in Argentina. And that's partly due to the activism of these groups, the tireless and creative activism of groups like IAGS, who wouldn't stand for that resonant violence being allowed to continue.
Mm-hmm. But I really appreciated the various different methods of memory that you engaged with, because I think it's really, I've discussed before in my work kind of like the symbolic justice, and it really is that it's not just trials, it's not just memorials, it's not just, it's all of these acts together. And so I'm picturing vividly in this as someone throwing the paint against the door, and and having these conversations. And as you mentioned, some people then shun them, and some people are just like, we're not engaging with this. And so it really show how those how sometimes the knowledge is transformative, but then also sometimes not, depending on the people and how they want to engage. So I really appreciated the different methods and mechanisms that you've discussed of how all the different ways that memory is really grappled with in this theory and in the world around us. So how did you what was your rationale? What was your thought process for choosing these particular case studies?
The case I first chose was Argentina because I had traveled there during my master's degree research, and I just sort of fell in love with the place, with the people, and with the creativity of the ways that the society deals with the past. So I knew Argentina was going to be a part of it from the beginning. And it's really hard to talk about genocide memory and the way that memory, if you're talking about the way that the memory sites function, without thinking of this paradigmatic case of the Holocaust, because the Holocaust has had a massive influence globally on the way that genocide is remembered, even in cases that don't have any direct connection to Europe, because of funding, and also just because of the way that, as the Aleda Aslan and others say, and Levy talk about cosmopolitan memory, the way that memory travels beyond the national container, and now it really, and thinking about multi-directional memory from Rothbard, memory doesn't happen in isolation now. So it's really hard. I wanted to have that paradigmatic case of the Holocaust, which has been so influential, to talk about. My third case was going to be Rwanda or Cambodia. And then I was talking to one of my advisors, and she's the one who really said, why don't you look at home? Like, we can't just think, and I was so glad she did, because I'm such a huge proponent now of this notion that of atrocity prevention isn't something, and atrocities and their prevention is not something that should only be thought about in the so-called global South. That it's something that every society needs to deal with, that has to reckon with, and in fact, of course, the United States is a country that was built on the dual atrocities of the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of African populations for many years. So I wanted to look at that, to look at my own country, and also part of the idea with resonant violence is thinking about how genocidal violence and its legacies don't only negatively impact victim groups. Those legacies are allowed to continue and to resonate onward because they positively impact other people. And I, as a non-native American, U.S. American, I benefit from that resonant violence of indigenous people, because I still live on indigenous land today that no longer belongs to indigenous people. I benefit from the legacies of slavery in the way that institutions in the United States are set up to consciously and unconsciously to benefit white people and not people of color. The reason that resonant violence is allowed to continue to resonate is because people like me benefit from that violence. So I wanted to really investigate that. And that's why those three cases are at the heart of the work.
I appreciate that. I have some similar reasons when I was looking at the World War II atrocities, and and I included the Japanese American internments, because I was like looking at these other countries, but it's like, what about at home? And the use of the law and the courts to imprison a mass amount of people on the basis of race. So I really appreciated the inclusion of the Native American case study as well. So obviously your book utilizes fieldwork, interviews, sites to sites. Can you describe a few of your more powerful visits or observations?
Sure. I mean, I'd say like the things that are most powerful, which I'm sure all of you who've done field work would agree with this, is the relationships and connections you make with people when you're visiting these and doing work in these different spaces. One group that I started off just interviewing them and then developed a long-term working relationship with is they're called Grupo de Arte Callejero, or Street Art Group. It's an Argentinian group of artists, and their image is on the cover of the book. I should have brought it over so I could hold it up. Now I don't know where it is on my shelf, but their image is on the cover of the book. And this is a group of artists who worked with those, they're of the generation of the children of the disappeared, and they worked with other activist groups like IAGS to create these street signs that would be hung up, and they look like real street signs, but when you look closer you see that actually what they're doing is telling stories iconographically of the violence perpetrated by the military dictatorship in Argentina. So they're trying to re-visibilize this violence that had been invisibilized, forgotten, to put it back into public space, back into the public sphere. So working with this group, started as just getting information from them to write about, right? But now when I became this curator of this Activism exhibition that Mel mentioned at the beginning, they were one of the first groups I reached out to see if we could include their work in this art exhibition that shows the connection between art, genocide, and human rights, genocide prevention at the Venice Biennale. And then that traveled to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So it's now become a continuing working relationship between that group. So that's always one of the best things that emerges out of this. And then I'd say one thing, one of the most memorable experiences I had in the process was actually for a chapter that didn't make it into the book that hopefully will be published soon as an article. When I traveled along the Trail of Tears in the United States. This was the 1,200 mile, it's about 2,000 kilometer trek that the Cherokee were forced to take from my home state of Georgia, where I grew up, to what's today Oklahoma, what then was outside of the country. And it's the largest act of ethnic cleansing in US history. And I went with my husband and another friend and drove that trail, stopping at many of the 80 plus sites along that trail that commemorate that journey. And that was a really powerful experience for me, just to see and confront the way that this dark, dark chapter of US history is commemorated and in many places forgotten in the US context. And that's a trip that I still think about all the time, and the conversations I had along the way and the people the places I saw along the way.
And so what would you say was your most challenging part of writing the book?
Yeah, the most challenging was just figuring out what to include and what I had to take out. When you do field work, as all of you know, like when you're doing this intense field work, there's like a million chapters you can write that you don't get to write because the book has a word limit, right? So there was all this work I did on doing field work in concentration camps in Germany that I ultimately couldn't put in the book, and I had to publish as separate articles. This process visiting the Trail of Tears was another thing, that a chapter that was supposed to end the book, but I just didn't have the space. So I'm trying to figure out a way to write about that now. And actually, like a moment that happened during that trip, I'd say was one of the most challenging moments for me in the process of doing the field work of the book. And I write about this, actually does make it into the conclusion of the book, this moment where my friends and I on this trip were visiting the Trail of Tears State Park in Missouri, which is a park alongside the Mississippi River where the Cherokee crossed the river on this journey in the winter of 1838 and 1839. And this park commemorates that journey. And in the visitor center of the park, they sold little, tchotchkes for to support the maintenance of the park. And one of those were these little lapel pins with the logo of the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. So we decided to buy some of those for to commemorate this trip. And I reached into my wallet to get the money to pay for them, and I pull out this $20 bill that has Andrew Jackson's face looking at me. And Andrew Jackson, of course, was one of the orchestrators of the Trail of Tears. He was one of the biggest perpetrators of genocide in US history. And yet he's on this bill that I was using to pay for this little pen. And then I went out of that store and looked at the license plate of the car that we were driving, which was my parents' car. And that license plate is the county where my parents live. And that's Jackson County, named after Andrew Jackson. And then that night we went to stay in a hotel in Jackson, Missouri, the city named after Andrew Jackson, because after he became a war hero in the War of 1812, where he massacred thousands of Muskogee Indians. And all of these were just these moments where you saw that everywhere you turned, Andrew Jackson was there and being commemorated not as a genocidaire, but as a war hero, as a populist leader, as one of the founders of the idea of what it means to be an American democracy today. And everywhere you turned when we would visit these sites along the Trail of Tears, there was almost no one there. We were really the only people at most of these sites. And that's something that is remarkable, because when I was doing the fieldwork in Argentina, when you do the fieldwork in Germany, there are, of course, these denialists are these people who may still support these leaders, but they're in the vast minority in those societies. You don't see a street named after Hitler or a park named after Videla in Argentina. And yet here in the US, our genocidaire won history. He's the one who's visible. And all of these people who were victims of his policy continue to suffer because of those policies, remain largely invisible to the vast majority of the US population. And that was a really challenging moment. And it continues to be a challenging moment as I try to figure out, okay, given that, what's my responsibility? What are our responsibilities given that reality?
I have to say, I was born in Missouri and lived there for a while. And then I did my undergraduate research in Oklahoma and lived there for quite a while. And I have to say, I don't think but keep in mind, I was younger then. So this was before I got into genocide studies. But as a child growing up, I don't believe I'd ever been to a Trail of Tears monument. I did learn about it in Oklahoma in school as part of Oklahoma history, but it was very brief. We didn't explore this and what it really meant. And so that's kind of surprising. My family still lives in Missouri, but yet I've never been to one of these monuments.
Yeah. You're
And
not
so
alone.
it's
Yeah.
It's very, just kind of like living. And now I'm like, next time I go home, I'm gonna be like, excuse me, why are we? Why haven't we not done this, mother? Sorry, mom. And so yes, it's some excellent points. Thank you very much for bringing those up. So I believe we will have to we're getting close to wrapping up. So are there any final thoughts or final comments you'd like to share with our viewers on your book?
Oh God, no, I don't think so. I think I've said enough. I'm really grateful for everyone coming, and hopefully it sparked some interest in the book. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to carry on the conversation with anyone who's interested, and also, thanks to all of the other scholars and academics on this field and in IAGS, because one thing I really love about being a part of this organization is that all of our work is influencing each other, and it's a place for us to learn from each other and find ways of collaborating. So I'm really grateful to the IAGS community for your work and the way that it's inspired mine, and hopefully this can give us something back. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
And thanks, Stephanie.
All right.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Kerry. That was fascinating. And I have to admit, Kerry, I have your book. It's on my desk in my office. And now I can't wait even more than before to read your book. That was really wonderful. And I really enjoyed hearing the personal side of how you came to choose your case studies and the personal connection that you made, with your own backyard, something that we think about. Stephanie, I also in my schooling growing up, did not learn anything about our First Nations history here in Australia. It was all about colonial history. I remember learning a lot about these cute little buildings that the colonials built, but nothing about the Indigenous history. I think a lot has changed now, which is really great, but I think that's a really important thing to look at and be thinking about these colonial genocides, but also what's in our backyard. And Kerry, and pardon the pun, but your concept of resonant violence really resonated with me, and absolutely agree with that. I hope that has inspired our audience to go out and read Kerry's book if they haven't already got it or haven't already read it. Certainly, as I said, I'm now even more looking forward to reading the copy that is on my desk. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, this inaugural IAGS book launch webinar. And I hope and encourage you to have a look at our webinar series. We have one every month coming up. And the next webinar will be Dr. Tim Williams in discussion with Dr. Holly Naiseth Nazir Tatira about Tim's book, The Complexity of Evil, Perpetration and Genocide. And that will be on the 14th of September. So please take a look at the IAGS website, genocidescholars.org. On our events page, we have the time, and the registration link will be up very soon for our next webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at future webinars.
Thanks.
Thank you.